This warning is important. What we are about to explore is disturbing. In the book of Judges, chapter 17, we find a dark and chaotic story that reveals just how far humanity can go when it loses its foundations. This account is not just any story in the Bible. It brings intense lessons about the consequences of lacking morality and responsibility. Imagine a world where each person does what seems right in their own understanding. No direction, no limits. This was the scenario in Israel during the time of the Judges. It was a society without a king and, more than that, without moral guidance. In this context, people begin to live for themselves, disconnected from any higher principles, and what emerges from this chaos goes beyond simple mistakes. It's a narrative of actions that shock and leave deep marks. But why is this story in the Bible? It urges us to reflect on how we handle our own values and the decisions we make, warning of the risks of living without solid principles. Get ready, because by understanding what really happened in Judges 17, we may discover something that transforms our view of right and wrong, raising questions that challenge our very morality. To understand this story in Judges 17, we need to transport ourselves to ancient Israel, a society in crisis and disorientation. This period was marked by profound social instabilities, where the lack of central leadership, tribal conflicts, and economic insecurity left the people abandoned. Unlike other biblical times where prophets and kings guided the people, Israel now had no leadership. The text describes this clearly: everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Imagine a society where there are no common rules and the sense of responsibility dissolves. This is not merely a cultural detail but the essence of what happens in the book of Judges. With no one to define what was right, and without a unifying code of conduct, people were left to their own values and impulses. The effect is like a silent decay, where each person thinks only of themselves, losing sight of the broader consequences. In Judges 17 we catch a glimpse of this disintegrated reality in the story of a man named Micah, who makes decisions based on what he considers convenient and just, even though these choices directly defy divine teachings. The situation becomes even more tragic when Micah's mother, rather than reprimanding him for his actions, ends up blessing him and even encouraging idolatry by gifting him molded silver in the form of an idol. These acts, though they may seem individual, reflect a scenario where what was sacred was lost, and in its place, people turned to practices and rituals that fulfilled their immediate needs. Instead of sincere worship, a distorted and personalized faith emerged, disregarding the central role of God in each person's life. The stage is set for what will become one of the Bible's darkest stories. The lack of responsibility and the abandonment of collective principles formed a fragmented society, and it is from this context that we follow the actions of Micah and those around him, witnessing how each individual choice creates ripples that affect the entire community. Now that we understand the context, let's dive deeper into the events of Judges 17 and the characters who clearly illustrate the moral decay of this period. First, we encounter Micah, a man from the tribe of Ephraim, who embodies the everyone does what they want mentality. He steals a considerable amount of silver from his own mother, but surprisingly when he confesses, she blesses him for returning the money and, even worse, decides to use part of this silver to make an idol. This is a clear example of how, without guiding principles, people distort their own beliefs and values. Micah doesn't stop at just one idol. He builds a sanctuary in his home and even appoints his son as a priest, completely disregarding the priesthood established by God. It's as if Micah is creating his own religion, where he picks and chooses what to follow and what to ignore, without any consideration for the true purpose of worship. The story then takes another unexpected turn when a young Levite from Bethlehem, who should be a defender of the faith, arrives at Micah's house seeking opportunities. Micah sees this as a chance to legitimize his idolatry, offering the Levite the role of priest in his household. The Levite readily accepts, setting aside his duty in favor of personal security, turning a blind eye to the kind of worship Micah had established. This Levite, who should have a sacred role, abandons his calling in favor of a job and security. He becomes complicit in false worship, reflecting the lack of spiritual integrity and responsibility that had spread throughout that time. Micah's family not only accepts but supports the creation of a private religion, where each person worships in their own way. This was a society that had lost its sense of the sacred. Then the tribe of Dan appears. Seeking new territory, they come across Micah's household, intrigued by his worship setup and the Levite he employs. Fascinated by the idea of having their own religious structure, the men of Dan decide to steal the idols and take the priest with them, as if they were transporting divine blessing in objects and rituals. When Micah discovers the theft, he tries to stop them, but the men of Dan are armed and make it clear that their faith is purely a matter of convenience. This is the peak of moral relativism. The idols that Micah created for protection are taken away without resistance. The men of Dan continue on their journey, conquering the city of Laish, where they establish their own religion centered on the stolen idols. This part of the story reveals a continuous cycle of moral and spiritual compromises that bring about consequences. Micah tries to secure himself by creating his own religious system, but ironically, he loses everything. The Levite, who traded integrity for security, now serves a tribe that acts with violence and moral ambiguity. And the tribe of Dan, which began its search for stability, ends up establishing a false worship, moving even further from the divine covenant. These events show how a personal decision, distorted by selfish motives, can impact an entire community. Each character in Judges 17 reflects an aspect of this society where true principles are traded for convenience. This narrative challenges us to consider the impact of our choices and how far a lack of solid values can lead an entire society. The story in Judges 17 goes beyond historical events. It reflects the distortion of values that occurs when responsibility and human dignity are lost. When Micah and his mother create idols, they not only ignore divine laws but also fail to see the societal impact of this choice. Disregarding God's guidance sets a dangerous precedent, where morality becomes subjective, shaped by personal interests rather than greater principles. Micah's decision to hire a Levite as his priest demonstrates a complete lack of responsibility. This Levite, who should be a symbol of spiritual integrity, trades his vocation for a more comfortable position. By abandoning his duty, he loses sight of the value of his role and the effect of his choices on the community. This is not just a personal failure. It signals that an entire society had lost respect for the sacred. Then, the tribe of Dan, in its pursuit of stability and conquest, perpetuates this cycle by stealing the idols and the priests to establish their own religion. Faith and human dignity thus become tools of self-interest, with even religion treated as a commodity. This story warns of what happens when responsibility is disregarded. We see how human dignity and the most basic values can be sacrificed, creating a legacy of pain and division. In Judges, the degradation of these values leads to an entire generation's disconnection from the sacred, opening doors to a fragmented and unstable existence. These small compromises, accumulating over time, create deep scars. The narrative in Judges 17 is a warning about the dangers of straying from God's path. The story begins with a simple compromise, like Micah's idolatry, but soon spirals into a sequence of tragedies and social chaos. By embracing idolatry, Micah and others end up bringing suffering into their lives, even though it initially seemed like a simple or even harmless solution. When people abandon solid principles, they make decisions with lasting impacts. This distancing from God not only leads to individual mistakes but also to a moral decay that spreads. Without God, the Israelites became vulnerable to their own desires and impulses, unable to see the long-term consequences. This story serves as a reminder for us about what can happen when we move away from foundational principles that uphold dignity and social balance. The departure from God in Judges reflects a warning that remains relevant today, highlighting the importance of maintaining a moral anchor for decisions that impact community life. When a society neglects responsibility, individual choices lead to a cycle of pain and destruction. Each decision made without integrity creates a legacy of isolation and suffering, passing on consequences that will last for generations. In Judges, these scars are not easily healed.